Welcome back to the next presentation in our series designed to help businesses making small amounts of hazardous waste comply with New Hampshire's hazardous waste rules. This next presentation is going to look at the storage requirements that apply to all very small quantity generators or businesses. These are things that you must have and the things that you must do with the area where you store hazardous waste. The list of requirements is found on page 4 of the VSQG Self-Certification Form, which is titled Section E, the basic requirements for storing hazardous waste. Please note that if you're going through these questions and check no to any of these, most likely there is a storage problem that needs to be corrected. You will want to correct these problems before sending the form back. Otherwise, NHDES will return the form to you and ask that you make those corrections. There may be a couple of situations where you are making hazardous waste, but these storage rules don't apply to you. The first and most common is when you have a parts washer unit that is periodically serviced by a vendor that you have a contract with. In this case, the vendor may change out the cleaning solution for the unit before it gets too dirty, such as on a schedule of every 90 days. Since the cleaning solution is removed from your business before it becomes a waste, there's no waste storage involved, but it would still need to be listed in Section D of the form. Remember, the hazardous waste rules only apply to waste, not product. The second situation used to be quite common, but is far less so now. Older photo and X-ray film developing units had solutions containing higher concentrations of silver. Since silver is a high value as a recycled precious metal, the storage requirements for these are more relaxed. After all, who's going to mishandle silver considering how much it would be worth? Also, please remember, you do not have to list universal waste, used oil for recycle, or pharmaceutical waste managed under their own rules in this section. But what about all those other hazardous wastes? We need to make sure we're storing them safely to protect the environment and to protect our personal safety, not to mention our financial liability. These next requirements are rules every business with hazardous waste must follow as basic precautions. The first thing we want you to do is identify where you're storing this stuff. If you have more than one area, write that one down too. If you have more than 2 storage areas, copy this page so you can check off the required items for all of your storage areas. Try to be somewhat specific with your description. For instance, a description of located throughout the building would not be good enough. Instead, use terms like by the southeast door or in the outdoor shed behind the building. The next item on our checklist is what types and size containers you are using to store your hazardous waste. Containers come in all kinds of sizes, with 5-gallon buckets and 55-gallon drums being the most common, but you may well have something different. Whatever the size, write it down, as well as what type of container it is, such as plastic bucket, metal drum, plastic drum, etc. Item number 3. Every container holding hazardous waste must be in good condition. But what does that mean? The first problems you should look for are containers that are badly rusted or severely dented. But how much rust is too much and how dented is too dented? Here you have to consider what the waste it is you're storing. A container holding damp rags, for instance, might be okay to store in a container that's pretty dented or rusted, but the same containers might be completely inadequate for storing liquid. The big consideration is whether the container will safely and securely hold your hazardous waste. Liquid wastes tend to be heavier per gallon, and if they leak, they travel further and faster, so they need a safer and more secure container. A second consideration is how well the container will close and seal. An open-top container that's out of round won't allow the lid to go on properly. A drum with stripped threads in the bunghole will likewise not allow you to close it properly. And a plastic bucket with a cracked lid won't do enough to hold liquids inside. Make sure that if you close the thing, it's actually going to hold the waste inside. Item number 4 says that the waste has to be compatible with the container or tank that it is stored in. There's all kinds of chemicals out there and all kinds of containers. Often when we've made some waste, we end up scrambling around to find any reasonable empty container to put it in. But reasonable isn't always good enough. Many chemicals need a container that's made of the right stuff, or the chemicals will damage the container by dissolving it or dissolving the seal on the cover, like this picture shows. Make sure that you're using the same kind of container for the waste that it was used for the chemical when it was a product, or you could end up with a big mess. While we're at it, we should mention that hazardous waste should be chemically compatible with other chemicals stored nearby too. You wouldn't mix ammonia and bleach to wash your floors, would you? Of course not, because you know that mixing the two would make a dangerous chlorine gas, which could result in the loss of life. Be aware that many chemicals don't get along with each other, and if they're accidentally combined, they can cause dangerous and even deadly situations. If you have chemicals that are incompatible with each other, store them in a way that they can't reach each other if one of them leaks or spills. You can do this by making sure there's enough distance between them, or if that's not possible, by putting a physical barrier such as a berm or wall between them. Also, don't forget about storage cabinets. Separate small containers of incompatible chemicals with trays, such as in this picture. And remember too that liquids run downhill. Be careful with storing incompatible waste on shelves above one another. Another problem we've seen is when a container is reused to store waste and there's residue of the original chemicals still in the container. It takes a surprisingly small amount of incompatible chemicals to have scary results. In this photo, a waste chemical was put into what seemed to be an empty bottle that used to have an incompatible chemical in it. However, just a little residue remained inside the cap, and half an hour later it was screwed back on, the container exploded. The more stuff you cram into an area, the more likely you are to have chemicals that don't get along near each other. Do you think the operator of this area could even tell you what was in each of these containers, let alone whether they're compatible with each other or not? Keeping your waste and product storage neat and organized will go a long way to help keeping you and your employees safe. Moving on to item number 5. Containers and tanks must be closed and sealed. The only time a container or tank holding hazardous waste is allowed to be open is when you're in the act of adding or removing waste. There are several reasons for this. First, we need to reduce the risk that the waste will be spilled. Second, we want to reduce the risk that the wrong thing can get into the waste. The wrong thing in some cases might be sparks, embers, or other ignition sources that can turn an ignitable waste into an inferno. In other cases, a closed and sealed container might prevent water from getting into the waste. You say you're not worried about water because your containers are stored indoors? Think again. A plumbing failure can and has resulted in waste flooding out of containers as they were filled with water spray. A closed and sealed container may also serve to slow down an operator who would otherwise put the wrong chemical into the container before they had time to think and realize what they were doing. And lastly, a closed and sealed container will keep fumes and vapors inside instead of spreading into your work area and into your lungs. We all like to use funnels in our containers and tanks because they work so well at limiting spills. They also encourage us to leave a container open. If you're going to use a funnel, use one that can be latched and closed and semi-permanently fastens to the container, such as by screwing it into the bung. That way, you can keep the container closed and sealed without sacrificing convenience. Another solution might be to install a funnel at the top of the self-closing ball valve that is screwed into the container. An operator will hold the valve open when they add waste, but it closes automatically when they step away. Here's a what not to do picture. Every container here has at least one opening, just inviting a spill or worse. Here's an extremely common example of an open container. Open-top 55-gallon containers usually have a lid, a gasket, and a ring that gets bolted into place. It's so much work to open and close these containers that an operator will just leave the ring unfastened. An inspector will give you a lot of sympathy for this, but no regulatory relief. Labs often have equipment operating intermediately that makes small amounts of waste. It's common to see a container such as this where a hose will empty into a small container. Having the hose in there is just fine if the equipment is operating and waste is being added to the container. But when the equipment is shut off, this is an open container violation. Sometimes a special cap, such as the one shown here, can be used to take care of this. There's a small outlet hose to allow air to escape as waste is entering the container, but it's small enough that an inspector wouldn't be worried about spills, leaks, or vapors. Another classic example of a violation is a drum or a bucket with a screw-in bung, where the bung is loose or removed altogether. These bungs need to be screwed in if you aren't adding or removing waste. Some containers are well designed to automatically close and work wonderfully, such as this flammable can. Keep an eye on them if you have them though. Over time, handling it can damage them to the point where they don't seal anymore. Note that these are also used for ignitable waste that readily vaporize. Those ignitable vapors in the air put you at an increased risk for a fire hazard and health issues. Item number 6 on the form asks if you store waste on an impervious surface. Impervious means something that stuff won't leak through. When we require storage on an impervious surface, we generally mean concrete or asphalt that's in good condition. It may be that you have something that will eat right through concrete or asphalt. Obviously, another material would be required to store this waste. Why do we want you to store on an impervious surface? 2 reasons. First, we want you to be able to quickly realize if there's a leak in the container. If you were storing on dirt or gravel, any leak could quickly disappear into the ground without you knowing. The second reason is that a container will generally last much longer if stored on an impervious surface. If you leave a metal container, such as a 55-gallon drum outside on dirt, it won't take long for the bottom of the container to rust. One day you'll move the container and realize that it's lighter than it should be. Then you'll find out that all the contents leaked out through the rusted bottom without you even knowing. How about a wooden floor? Lots of old mill buildings have wooden construction, but don't store hazardous waste on these surfaces. Leaks will seep between the boards to areas below. If you have wooden floors, put a durable, impervious material under any containers or tanks. Here is an awesome example of storage on an impervious surface. Not only does this facility have its hazardous waste on a concrete floor, but they went a step further by putting the contents on spill containment pallets. Well done. Our next compliance item, number 7, is checking to make sure you don't have hazardous waste stored near a working drain. The term working drain means any functioning floor drain or sink drain, as well as any area that slopes down towards one of these drains. All drains go somewhere. Most likely you don't know where, but I guarantee that if a hazardous waste goes in a drain, it's going to end up somewhere else before you have a chance to stop it. And that place it ends up may be pretty dangerous or expensive. It might be that you simply don't have another place in your shop where you can put the hazardous waste. It has to be near a drain. If that's the case, then the waste must be put inside secondary containment, which is a larger container or tray that is big enough to hold any spills or leaks that happen if the container were to fail. This is a great time to take a tour of your building with an eye out for drains. Watch the floor for grates, sumps, and portholes. Look to see what's being stored near sinks. Sinks are magnets for leaking containers because that's how we're taught to deal with leaking containers at home. But it's not the same in the workplace. Lastly, watch out for lab hoods. They frequently have a small oval sink in the back that no one seems to need. But if an operator knocks over a container while working in the hood, that spill is headed for the sink. And then, where? In item number 8, we have some additional requirements if our hazardous waste is stored outside. Your facility might be small and there just isn't room to keep your hazardous waste inside. Or maybe you have a process that makes a lot of heat, flames, or sparks, and your waste is safer if stored outside. But when storing outside, it's way too easy to forget about them. You aren't out there regularly checking to make sure everything is safe. For that reason and others, we have extra rules to make sure that you and everyone else is kept safe. These extra rules include storing containers and tanks in secondary containment. The outdoors isn't all that different from floor drains. If a spill or leak happens, a slope in the ground can move waste rapidly to a place where it can do a lot of damage before you have a chance to stop it. Also, if you have outdoor storage, those wastes need to be covered to protect them from rain and snow. Secondary containment won't do any good if it's filled with rain or snow, so we require that it be covered to protect it from the weather too. While these are important controls, to be on the safe side, we want you to make sure your wastes are located a safe distance from things that are at extra risk from damage. We require setback distances from surface water like marshes, streams, and lakes, storm drains, and private wells. Don't forget that your own well counts too. Lastly, be aware of any public water supplies nearby. These wells that serve 25 or more people. The setback distance varies for each of these and should be recorded with your local government. Storing directly on the dirt with no secondary containment is a recipe for trouble. You can see that the soil nearby is already stained from previous spills. If these waste containers were covered, not only would they be dry, but it might have made them easier for the snowplow driver to see. Items number 9 through 15 apply to all containers and tanks of hazardous waste, no matter where they're stored, inside or outside. They include requirements for labeling containers and emergency equipment that must be kept near the hazardous waste. Let's look at the labeling requirements first. We need containers holding hazardous waste to be labeled so that you, your staff, and anyone else in your business can quickly recognize what this is and that it's dangerous. Think about the fire company responding to an emergency at your business. Wouldn't you want them to be able to quickly identify things that pose an immediate danger? Of course you do. First, make sure that all containers holding hazardous waste have the words hazardous waste on them. This should help grab everyone's attention. Second, write a description of what's inside. Be specific enough that it's readily helpful, but don't be so specific that only chemists and rocket scientists can understand it. Terms like waste paint, used solvents, or waste acids are typical examples. Lastly, don't forget that if you can't see the words, you can't read the label. These labels or words must be visible, or the words are useless, and you'll be in violation. These markings are neat and pretty on store-bought labels like this one, but if you run out of labels, you can mark the containers yourself. Just make sure that the words are permanent and readable. In this photo, they may have the words hazardous waste and a description of the contents, but it has to be clear and readable. Is there hazardous waste in this container or not? With this half-removed label, we don't really know. This picture shows a pretty common situation. The company has a messy process that makes hazardous waste, and despite their best efforts, spills and drips happen. That's understandable. But you have to have a way to make sure that those labels stay clear and readable. Whether that means having spare labels that get put on after the spillage, or better yet, a dependable way to avoid the spills in the first place. If you have a minor emergency at your business, you want to keep it that way. That's what we want too, so we require that you have certain emergency response items readily available near your hazardous waste storage area. The first is absorbent material. We are not fussy about what type of absorbents you have. They can be rags, sand, or any other material that does the job. Next, you need to have fire control equipment such as fire extinguishers. Make sure they're the right kind for the right types of materials you have, and make sure they're properly maintained. If you have ignitable or reactive waste, you'll also need a no smoking sign or some similar sign like no ignition sources or no open flames near your waste storage area. We're not particular about how fancy the sign is as long as it's, once again, clear and readable. By the way, it doesn't matter if your facility is a non-smoking facility. You still need to meet the rule. We've been in a non-smoking facility and watched a truck driver smoking on the loading dock right next to ignitable waste. Lastly, the rules require at least 2 feet of aisle space on one side of the container. This is sometimes a challenge when you have a smaller facility and where there's a lot of people using it. Not only is space limited for the containers, but employees like to put things in the aisle because that's the most convenient place with room. You know how it goes, an empty space likes to get filled. The idea, though, is to make sure that you can get between the containers to check that there are no leaks, damage, or other risks to them. It's also intended to give you access in an emergency response, such as throwing down spill control or getting in there with a fire extinguisher. This same rule applies if the containers are smaller, like 5-gallon buckets stored on the shop floor or pallets, but isn't required for very small containers in a cabinet or on a shelf. Here's an example. If we look at this storage room, we can see we can put containers in the corner and that there's nothing else nearby, so it's easily 2 feet of aisle space. In this example, we could keep going right along the wall and still stay in compliance because there's 2 feet of aisle space on at least one side of each container. If we had so many containers that we need to start another row, that would be fine as long as we keep 2 feet of distance between the rows. But if we think we can save space by adding another container between them, it won't work because now the one in the corner doesn't have any aisle space. To continue on with this idea, we could place another row up against the back side of this one, and a fourth row, and so on. As long as there's 2 feet of aisle space on one side of the containers, you're good. Here's a terrific example of adequate aisle space. Making it neat to start with encourages you and your staff to keep it neat later on. Remember this photo from before? Here's another winner. Nice job, folks. The aisle space here is not 2 feet. Don't let this happen at your facility. An innocent oversight to be sure, but a little more work is needed to get it right. Item number 16 on the form. The last item on this page is really a notice that if you have more than 440 pounds, or about a 55-gallon drum, of non-acute hazardous waste in storage, you have a higher level of risk and therefore have some additional requirements to meet. On this line, tell us if you have more than 440 pounds or not. If you do, make sure you complete the checklist on page 6. If you never have more than 440 pounds, congratulations, you do not have to fill out that page. One last note about storage amounts and storage times. As long as you manage your waste appropriately, as discussed on the previous slides, VSQGs can store up to 440 pounds of non-acute hazardous waste for an unlimited amount of time. If a VSQG accumulates more than 440 pounds, but less than 2,200 pounds, and follows the extra requirements under the extended accumulation requirements on page 6 of this form, they can store their waste for an unlimited amount of time. Once a VSQG gets close to that 2,200 pound limit, which equals about 4.5 55-gallon drums, the waste would need to be shipped off before going over that limit, or they would be regulated under the much more stringent Large Quantity Generator, or LQG requirements, and no one wants that headache. This concludes the presentation about page 4. Our next presentation will look at section F on the bottom of page 4, which reviews your shipping papers. We have more presentations to help you understand these and other regulations. But if you'd just like to talk to a person instead of a computer, we want to help. Give us a call at one of these numbers during normal working hours. Please leave a message if we don't connect and we'll return your call. If email is your preference, we've got you covered. You can reach us at vsqg@des.nh.gov.